we start our next session, anyone have any question about anything on any topic? If not, we'll just launch into the next session. Okay, so this is our Gita from Zero intro section, number 11. And here we're going to talk about interpretations, but this time we're going to talk about various questionable interpretations and why we consider them to be questionable interpretations of Bhagavad Gita. Again, we have our Bhagavad Gita verse. In this case, we're in chapter 2, but at verse 7. So we were a little bit before talking about, wait a minute, I think this is not, I'm not sure if this verse is the right number. I may have forgotten to change it. Yeah, I forgot to change it. That verse is actually from somewhere else. That's actually 243 to 42 to 43. That's where it should be. Yam imam pushpitam vacham pravadanti avipashchitaha vedavada rata parta nanyad astiti vadinaha kamat manasvara para janma karma pala pradam kriya vishesha bahulang bogaishvarya gatim prakti. So this verse translates as, men of small knowledge are very much attached to the flowery words of the Vedas, which recommend various fruitive activities for elevation to heavenly planets, resultant good birth, power, and so forth. Being desirous of sense gratification, opulent life, they say that there is nothing more than this. So in this verse, which is not 2:7 but 2:42 to 2:43, this verse is explaining that there is a class of people who miscomprehend the Vedas. And so this is a wrong interpretation. Or we could say a lesser interpretation in this case. The Vedas certainly do advocate and give prescriptions for going to the heavenly planets, for getting a good birth, for living a happy life on the earth, for being freed from various unwanted, difficulties and menacing, malevolent persons and planets and all this kind of stuff. So the Vedas do have those prescriptions, but Krishna is calling them men of small knowledge. So these aspects of the Vedas are really just explaining how to become materially happy. And so if one approaches the Vedas, and this is all they get from the Vedas, Bhagavad Gita or any other thing, then they've really missed the point of the Vedas. We see that the Vedas have a purpose, and here, this is not the purpose. Krishna is describing at least this particular viewpoint, this particular interpretation of the Vedas is a lesser interpretation. It's not an important interpretation. Questions about that? Did I skip one? Yeah, not only one, I skipped many. Okay, so let's look at one class of wrong interpretations of the Vedas, or questionable interpretations of the Vedas. So one quite large, vocal, and well-traveled and trafficked interpretation of the Vedas is the Sankaracharya version, which talks about the Supreme as non-personal. So this is the sometimes called the Brahman, sometimes called the white light, sometimes called the all one. There's many, many different names. We talked about this last week as an entire wing of Vedic orientation. But this is not Vaishnavism. This is Advaita Vedanta. Vaishnavism sees Krishna, the Supreme Person, as the Supreme Being, and service to Him is the real purpose of life. Advaita Vedanta does not see things that way. They see the Brahman, the impersonal effulgence, as the supreme thing, and one rather wants to merge with that. So it's a very different goal and a very different process. So there is one famous Indian scholar who said, it is not to Krishna we have to surrender, but to the unborn within Krishna. So this is the way that he put it. And many people do try to explain that the Bhagavad Gita teaches this understanding of the impersonal form. It does discuss the impersonal form. As a matter of fact, in chapter 11, we have the universal form, which is somewhat related to the impersonal form. But Krishna, in Bhagavad Gita, he does not give importance to this form. As a matter of fact, he says, Brahmano hi pratishtaham, which is actually Krishna describing that the Brahman comes from him, not the other way around. That it's not, sometimes people describe it as like some kind of lake, and you have various people sitting on the various perimeter locations on the lake, and it gets cold, and so it begins to freeze a little bit around this edge, and it begins to freeze a little bit around that edge. And so those people who are, Christians, their part freezes and it looks like Jesus, and over here we have people who are, worshiping Krishna, and their part freezes and it looks like Krishna, and people who are Shaivites, their part looks like Shiva, and the part over here where people are worshiping Durga Devi, it looks like Durga Devi. But the Advaita Vedantins, they understand that it's all water, and that as soon as the temperature rises, it'll become depersonalized again. It'll stop being solid. So this is the kind of analogy that's used. But Krishna does not at all agree with this understanding. Rather, in 12th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, we have a section where Arjuna directly asks Krishna, which should I worship? should I engage in service to your personal form, or should I rather focus on the unmanifest, that which lies beyond the perception of the senses, the fixed, immovable, the impersonal conception of the absolute, by doing various Vedic formulas and being equally disposed to all? Should I do that? So Arjuna is asking Krishna point blank the question of which is better, to worship the personal form or to worship the unmanifested impersonal form. That's in chapter 2. And Krishna answers point blank, that it's better to worship my personal form. Then he says, in the next verse over, he says, but those who worship the unmanifested, they too at last achieve me. But then Krishna gives a disclaimer after that, saying that, but advancement in that path is very troublesome for those who are embodied. So this is not an easy way to go. And why is it not easy? Because we're people. People mean we have personalities, and we have likes and dislikes. We want relationships, and this is natural. As a person, we want a relationship. We can have a relationship with Krishna. We cannot have a relationship with the Brahman. It's just depersonalized. So there's nothing to have a relationship with, and that's why there's a verse in Bhagavatam where it says, Ye ne rabindaksha vimukta maninas tvayashta bhavadabhishuddha buddhaya, that there are those who imagine themselves very advanced, but actually, because they're not fixed on your lotus feet, they fall down because their intelligence is abhishuddha, it's not purified. So persons who do actually go to the Brahman, and you can merge with Brahman, at least for a time, because there's nothing at all going on in the Brahman. It's not a suffering state, but at the same time, there's no form, there's no variety, there's no action, there's no rasa, there's no lila, nothing's going on there. So the person becomes unsatisfied by that condition and comes back out. And usually then, as Prabhupada usually says, people who have merged with the Brahman, they come out and they start hospitals and political parties and things like that, try to do some welfare work in the world. So Krishna does not advocate for that possible direction that a person goes in their spiritual life. So if someone is trying to stroke the Bhagavad Gita and come up with this understanding out of the Bhagavad Gita, then Krishna directly contrasts against that understanding in Bhagavad Gita. Questions about it? We do this so that when it gets put up to YouTube.
Yeah. So do they come back from Brahman, and they start like hospitals? Is it because they are unsatisfied by the condition and they realize that they're meant to serve? Okay.
Prabhupada actually says that in his introduction. I've said that I did a long introduction to Bhagavad Gita because Prabhupada did a long introduction to Bhagavad Gita, and I wanted to try to, again, put Bhagavad Gita in context, into a framework, because it's easy to just get lost with Bhagavad Gita. It's just so all over the place, and it's so far removed from the literature we used to, the culture that we are familiar with, the world that we usually live in. It's just so distant, so I'm trying to build a bridge. So Prabhupada explains that everyone has to serve. We have a natural essence as a human being, and that is that we are servants. We are servants of Krishna. So we have Jivara Swarupoya Krishnara Nityadas, that the Swarup, or the eternal relationship of the living entity, is service. to Krishna. So if we refuse to serve Krishna, we will serve something. So some cases people serve their family, sometimes people serve their country, sometimes people serve some political party, or as Prabhupada says, in all those fail, at least people will serve their pets, so he will serve something, so this is the nature of the service quality of the living entity coming out. And we are not satisfied in depersonalizing into the Brahman. We, even though it's not a position of distress, still, since there's no lila, there's no rasa, there's no change, we cannot be satisfied there in the long run, and we come back out. So that's why we have to move on from that. So there are people who will read Bhagavad Gita and try to read Krishna as being the embodiment or the symbol or the emblem of the universe, a pantheistic view. Krishna actually describes all these kinds of views in various places in Bhagavad Gita. He describes in chapter 9, the Ekat Vena, the Pritak Vena Bahuda, and the Vishvatamuk, So Ekat Vena is the impersonalist, the one who is trying to merge with Brahman. Krishna describes that as a lower understanding of the Supreme. And he describes that there is a Pritak Vena Bahuda, the demigod worshipper, people who do not focus in on one being, but actually think that there are many demigods and worship them all equally, or whatever their preferences happen to be. And then finally the Vishvatamuk, which is the universal form. That we commonly call in our modern terminology pantheism, the universe as the supreme being. So one other thing that I can touch on real quick here is the void, which is a whole nother thing. It's a completely different concept, which is usually only spoken of by Buddhists, but in Western philosophy it gets a lot of airplay too, this idea of the null, and so sometimes we say that the Buddhists are focused on zero, the Māyāvādis are focused on 1, and the devotees are focused on 2. So we have 0, 1, and 2. So we see the relationship between the living entity and the Supreme. So the void is something that's impossible to talk about or think about, and but it's very central to Buddhist philosophy. Again, because it has no form or features, then it's not something that human beings can relate to. We're told that there's some mystic state of consciousness in which we can relate to the void, but ultimately this is not there. Can you get the microphone here? Thank you very much, Kila.
One of the devotees told me that Buddha Siddhartha came as an extension of Krishna, and so is Buddhism
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yes.
Okay, so did the Buddhism get distorted after some point? Because
no,
it's not the same teachings from Krishna?
No. Buddha actually came he had a particular mission to fulfill. And although he was what we call a Shaktavesha avatar, he was a living entity like you and me, but he had special potency to do something very grand and marvelous in the world. And what he did was he taught Buddhist philosophy. The reason he did was because the Vedic culture had degraded into a travesty. We talked about a little while ago about these interpretations. So at a certain point, these interpretations broke into 6 different ones. These were all part of one system for understanding the whole process of spiritual life. And it started with, what we usually call as nyaya or logic. And then the next step was Vaisheshika, which is atomic philosophy, how we learn about atoms. Then we go into Sankhya, which talks about how a person should relate to others and how one should purify themselves. And then we go into Yoga, which is the philosophy of various bodily postures to develop a focus in the mind. And finally, Karma Mimamsa. Now, Karma Mimamsa was a philosophy about karmic action. And Karma Mimamsa, these, as I said, were all parts of the same machine, part of the same philosophy. But at a certain point, after the departure of Krishna from the world, and after the departure of his immediate sons and grandsons, then these 6 philosophies gradually split apart as different processes, as even different viewpoints, and they became atheistic in their outlook. And so this was how the philosophy drifted. And eventually these karma mimamsakas, their main explanation of how one goes forward in life is to make sacrifices, but they advocated animal sacrifice. So these animal sacrifices were done in huge number and very brutal, and of course they were really just a pretext to eat the animals, you know. And so Buddha came to put a stop to that. That's why Krishna sent Buddha, and Buddha did that. Buddhism took hold and it pushed out the karma mimamsakas, you know, and eventually Emperor Ashoka embraced Buddhism, and it became the state religion of India for a time, not just for a short time, but quite a long time. And then eventually Sankaracharya came and pushed Buddhism out again. But he taught a philosophy that was very similar to Buddhism, so that's how the Advaita Vedanta relates to Buddhism. It's not Buddhism, but it's similar in many ways. And the reason Buddhism came in was that in this way the travesty of killing huge amounts of animals on the plea of Vedic sacrifice, really for the only real purpose of eating the animals, that would be stopped in a large way, and that was why Krishna sent Buddha, you know, to perform that. And that was his main central teaching, is ahimsa, which is ironic because mostly in the modern world, most Buddhists are not vegetarian, at least the ones that I've run into. But there is a certain group of them that are, you know. There's the Folkwang Sang, or there's, I forget what the name of that whole sect is, but they are very militant vegetarians, which is, they've done a lot of good stuff in Taiwan and other places.
Where did the void come in?
Well, the void was this idea that Buddhism teaches that there is no self, that the whole universe is actually void. Everything is a misconception. Now, Brahman at least teaches that there is a positive thing, that there is a plus white light. Now, the void goes beyond that there's no nothing, no how, you know, so that's basically what it is. And not every kind of Buddhism teaches this. So there is, you know, Hinayana and Mahayana Buddhism. So Mahayana is the great boat, and Mahayana Buddhism, at least the Mahayana Buddhists that I've come in contact with, are only a hair's breadth different from Vaishnavas, you know, as far as I can tell. But the Hinayana, the ones that are, you know, actually believing that there is only the void, those Buddhists are the ones that are written about in Buddhist books. You know, those are the ones you actually hear about, you know, with their meditations to depersonalize into nothing, you know. So they claim that all existence is suffering, and desire causes suffering. So to be free from suffering, you have to be free from desire. To be free from desire, you have to be free from everything. So these are usually called the Theravada Buddhists. And these Theravada Buddhists talk about the void. The other Buddhists don't really talk about that so much, as far as I've been aware of, you know. Bhaktivinoda Thakur, in one of his writings, says that he met a Buddhist from Myanmar one time, and he asked him what Buddhism was all about. And Buddhists from Myanmar said that Buddha was God, and he came, and what we do is we want to try to serve Buddha so we can go to the place where Buddha is when we, leave our bodies. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur writes in his book saying that this Buddhist obviously had never read any Buddhist literature, and that he did not know he was not describing his religion, he was describing our religion. Right. So, and I've found it too, that when I would go into Buddhist temples, that essentially they look exactly like Vaishnava temples, except for instead of deities of deities of Radha and Krishna or whatever, there's deities of Buddha there. And ladies are coming in with sacks of flour and rice and offering incense, and there's arti trays, and the whole thing, the setup looks really, really similar. But that's Mahayana Buddhist, whereas Hinayana Buddhists, or the Theravada school, they don't go in for any of that stuff mostly. They're about this very difficult meditation and difficult personal deprivation that brings you to the point where you come in contact with the void and realize you don't exist and never did, et cetera, et cetera. So, any other questions here? Yes.
I have a question because about the merging with the Brahman. Like our soul, according to the Māyāvāda philosophy, then we would go, or our philosophy too, about this. Like we would go, the soul would go to Brahman and like merge. But then after some time, because that's not our purpose or satisfying, we would come back. So would we unmerge then?
Right.
But how can a soul being merged?
Right. That's
Unmerge,
a good question.
like again, come together, like you're already merged. That's already done, right?
Yeah, well, the thing we can say is we merge, but we don't merge. You know, that there is a type of merging that occurs when we say that Krishna's effulgence, his Brahm Jyoti, is actually like the sun shoots out photons, is the way we think about it in our modern scientific terminology. In a similar way, Krishna shoots out particles of light that are not photons. They're actually jiva souls, tiny, shiny particles. Now, this tiny particle is what the jiva becomes when the jiva leaves the spiritual world and enters into the material world. He compresses down into a tiny, shiny particle. And so that tiny shiny particle can stay in continuity with other tiny shiny particles in the Brahma Jyoti and then eventually come back out again. But when the shiny particle comes out into the material world after exiting the Brahma Jyoti, the shiny particle takes the seat in the heart of a material body. Now, if that shining particle goes back to the spiritual world, expands back into the original form of that living entity in the spiritual world in his original relationship with the Supreme Lord. So that is what happens there. So we don't really depersonalize. We just suppress our individuality for a time. So it's kind of described in that way, you know, that we're our individuality is suppressed. Krishna says, you know, that Jiva Bhuta Sanatana, that these living entities are my eternal fragmental parts. So as a fragment, they never cease to be one fragment and become some kind of globular, you know, multi-fragment or something like that. But they can hover next to one another in a merged condition where their individual qualities are not manifest, just their sat part. Krishna, Prabhupada says in the introduction to Bhagavad Gita that the Brahman has only the sat feature of the spiritual world. It doesn't have the chit and the ananda feature, whereas the Paramatma has the sat and chit feature. But only when one goes and it gets a full spiritual form and engages in a relationship with Krishna, at that point do you get sat, chit, and ananda. So the Brahman only has the sat. So the eternality is there, and the absence of suffering and the absence of ignorance is there. But there's no genuine ananda and there's no genuine chit. So we don't really merge, we just sort of merge or something like that. Okay. So this was one particular class of questionable interpretations. And as I said, if someone puts forward their version of Bhagavad Gita with this interpretation, we have to think, well, what did they do with chapter 12? Where Krishna specifically is asked the question by Arjuna, should I do this impersonalism, or should I worship your personal form? And Krishna recommends the personal form. So here's another. The ever-present, ever-popular yoga interpretation, that the Bhagavad Gita is a yoga book and teaches us how to practice yoga and the importance of doing Ashtanga yoga. Of course, it can not be denied that chapter 6 is all about yoga. Krishna talks about it. But the question is that we find that at the end of Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna does not go meditate somewhere. He actually gets on a chariot and starts to fight a war. So if that's true, then we have to say Arjuna missed the point, So it's obvious that Krishna did not intend for Arjuna to be an Ashtanga yogi. Prabhupada says that after, speaking the Bhagavad Gita, there's no historical account of Arjuna being a yogi or practicing yoga at any time. I think he did maybe before, but afterwards he certainly didn't. And so in Kali Yuga, it's not practical. After Krishna explains the Ashtanga yoga process to Arjuna in chapter 6, what does Arjuna say? He says, what you're talking about appears impractical and unendurable for me. Arjuna says, I can't hack it. And Krishna tells him, you can do it by constant practice and detachment, but he doesn't want Arjuna to be that kind of yogi, a meditating yogi. He's not asking Arjuna to do that, and Arjuna doesn't do that, in fact. And in chapter 3, Krishna goes through this long-winded explanation that he wants Arjuna to be active. You can't sit on the senses, which is what the yogis do. So this idea that somehow or other Bhagavad Gita is a book that is designed to help you to become very fixed up in your practice of Ashtanga yoga doesn't really cut the mustard either. It's a forced, explanation. And of course, as we see that if you do try to perform Ashtanga yoga as a spiritual discipline, this is not to say that yoga is not healthy for you and all that kind. That's a whole other thing. We're not taking issue with people who do yoga for physical and personal body reasons. That's a whole other thing. But people who are using yoga as their main spiritual process, it's not going to work, not in Kali Yuga. It might have worked in Satya Yuga, but not in Kali Yuga. So Krishna tells Arjuna at the end of chapter 6 he wants him to be a yogi, but he explains what kind of yogi he wants him to be. And it's not a dhyana or an Ashtanga yogi. He wants him to be a bhakti yogi, which is a different kind of yogi. So of course, if one gets involved in yoga, then generally the attraction is to cities or very mystic processes. And it's a very austere and lonely process if you're really going to do yoga as a spiritual discipline. Questions? about any of that. So this is probably the most common, misinterpretation or wrong interpretation upon which to look through Bhagavad Gita, and that is what I call the mythological interpretation. So in colleges, in various scholastic and academic settings, people talk about Gita because it's very interesting. It's a book that was written so many years ago, and what do these people think? It's interesting from an anthropological point of view. It's interesting from a sociological point of view. How did they live? What kind of social structure did they have? What kind of morals did they hold to? But if you read Gita with this kind of viewpoint, it won't do much for you, because this viewpoint of Bhagavad Gita assumes that either Krishna never existed or that Krishna was just a prince, like so many people who have lived and died on this earth. So Bhagavad Gita has no significance other than this prince, 50 centuries ago or whenever they say it was, had some ideas about it. And of course, we run into notions and concepts in Bhagavad Gita that certainly don't follow our modern scientific viewpoints of looking things. And therefore, this mythological viewpoint assumes the Vedas are a quaint mysticism from an ancient time, and that the cosmology is primitive and it's part of a pre-scientific culture. It's very shackled with, as our modern viewpoint is, of supernatural. So we said the other day that the hallmark of modern Western philosophy is that it rigorously throws out the supernatural. We can only talk about the natural, not the supernatural. So if one has this kind of interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita won't do much for you. It'll at best be a curiosity from an ancient time, like looking at some hieroglyphics on a cave in France or something like that. That's kind of the most it'll do for you. But it certainly won't change your life. Neither will, as we just talked about, the Māyāvāda interpretation of it. That won't change your life in a positive way either. Any questions about that? I would have spent more time like this, but I'm trying to keep to my time. Okay, so we'll move to yet another possible view, the demigod interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita. Oftentimes people who read Bhagavad Gita are very serious about worshiping various demigods, especially in India. So they usually consider these various demigods to be on the same level as Krishna, and their goal is to eventually enter the heavenly worlds. And this is a very materialistic view. And, Krishna, he actually explains that he is the source of the demigods, aham adir hi devanam. They are not just equal with him, but he is the source of the demigods. And then in chapter 7 in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says that when people's hearts are distorted by material desire, I make their faith steady in the demigods. And he mentions that people who worship demigods worship him only, but they do so in a wrong way. So Krishna is very clear that demigod worship is not really, again, it's one of those things that's there in the Vedas. For people who have a problem with bhakti, then at least they're doing something that's not completely wrong. But it's certainly not on the same level, and this is an interpretation of Bhagavad Gita that also doesn't hold water, because Krishna speaks against it in the Bhagavad Gita. So that's one of the reasons I'm bringing it up, is that Krishna is himself making a pronouncement on this kind of viewpoint or this kind of orientation. So if somebody presents Bhagavad Gita as a writing of ancient Indian, Vedic literature like the Rig, Sama, Atharva, Yajur Veda, which puts forward and makes important the idea of worshiping demigods. That's not really what Bhagavad Gita is saying, according to Bhagavad Gita. Any questions about that? Okay. Now we've got, this is a more modern, the virtue interpretation, that Bhagavad Gita is just a kind of self-help book where you can get all kinds of little do's and don'ts about how you can be a good person and make your karma better, or maybe you don't even believe in karma, you just see that there's a lot of good ideas in the Bhagavad Gita and you can live with them, and maybe you can go to heaven, or maybe you'll just be happy in this world, or whatever. This is a kind of more modern view where we not even really accepted demigods or the larger picture, but it's just the Bhagavad Gita is about virtue. And we do see that oftentimes people who give commentaries on Bhagavad Gita have this basic sort of viewpoint, that they're seeing Bhagavad Gita as a kind of collection of good points, good tips for living a good life, something like that. So again, you'll certainly get some benefit out of the Bhagavad Gita, but this will really miss the main thrust of what Bhagavad Gita is there to help you with. And there's another one here, Sahajiyā interpretation. This is for people who are a little more kind of out there, The Sahajiyā mentality comes from Saha, which is the natural way. And so people who are Sahajiyas put forward that we don't have to really worry much with the restrictions in spiritual life, because we will naturally go to Krishna. And so oftentimes their main and only function is to mimic the pastimes of Krishna, which they do, Bhaktivinoda Thakur talked about these various bolas, olas, and atibaris, and all these other groups, which mostly are centered in Bengal, but they exist in other places. And they would say good things about Bhagavad Gita, but they wouldn't spend much time reading it, because really their whole process is to engage in basically sexual activities, along with some nice additives of hashish and things like that, so that you can have extra special potency. And they all claim that because they are mimicking the pastimes of Krishna, that they are becoming actually connected in that way. Of course, in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna talks a lot about sense control, so this is obviously not what Krishna is advocating in Bhagavad Gita, though some might go this route. So this is another kind of interpretation that we can't take very seriously, although you will find people who have this kind of interpretation. In fact, recently I came across one quite well-known scholar who seems to be putting forward something like this, but I won't get into that. So another important thing that I find amazing, and Prabhupada did too, was that certain commentators have somehow pulled a non-violent message, Gandhi particularly, out of Bhagavad Gita, whereas what's, patently obvious is that Arjuna was intent on being nonviolent until Krishna spoke the Bhagavad Gita, and he got Arjuna to go from, I'm not going to fight to I'm going to fight, So how somebody can whip up a nonviolent theme from Bhagavad Gita. Of course, we're not advocates of violence per se, but the whole point is that in this particular case, Krishna had tried everything else, and so did everybody else. And Duryodhana was certain that he wasn't going to give even a amount of land that would be put on the head of a pin to the Pandavas. So there was only one recourse that they had, and that was to engage in a battle. So, it's kind of interesting that somehow or other still, in spite of the fact that the Gita seems to be going the opposite way, some people come up with a nonviolent interpretation out of the Bhagavad Gita. Any questions there? Okay, now this is next to the last slide here. Metaphoric. This is similar to the earlier one that I was talking about, the mythological one, but it's a little different. This is quite common. Many people will describe Bhagavad Gita as a metaphor, meaning that, there was no Arjuna, there was no Krishna, there was no battle. This is like, John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress or something like that, that it's intended as a parable about how one should act, and all the details are fiction, but the parable is there, and the parable is what's worthwhile. So that in general, they kind of give this cast over all the Vedic explanations, because then this solves the problem of having problems with modern scientific viewpoint, or with describing some things that are very difficult to explain in our modern Western thinking, because if none of this actually happened and it's just an allegory, then we don't have any of those problems. So oftentimes, very often, you'll see Bhagavad Gita described in a metaphoric way, that one person, explained that the Pandavas were like the five senses or something like that. Now, one can see these various, analogies there. There's nothing wrong with that. But what these people are putting forward is that that's all there is. There was no Bhagavad Gita. There was no Battle of Kurukshetra. There was no Krishna. There was no Arjuna. There were no Pandavas. But this was a story written by some ancient writer that was supposed to help us understand how to live life better. And so, again, if you approach Bhagavad Gita in this way, then certainly you won't get the real benefit of Bhagavad Gita. So, all right, any questions with that? So this is our last slide here, and I'm a little over here, so... for people to make use of Bhagavad Gita, and Prabhupada kind of leads up to this in his introduction to Bhagavad Gita, is what is our goal? If our goal is to enjoy our senses, then Bhagavad Gita doesn't really have anything to offer you. You won't have any real benefit from it. And, as long as a person seriously thinks that there is such a thing as material happiness, and one can get it by the hard work and rapacious intelligence that we bring to it in our life, then one will not be interested in Bhagavad Gita, and the goal will be sense gratification. And good luck with that is all I got to say. I agree. It's a serious position of life that most people hold fast to. But as the years cross by, we see one after another our various amazing and foolproof plans for enjoying in the material world somehow flop. And so probably I would say by the time most of us are, teenagers, we've had at least one or two major life plans for enjoying big time sense gratification fail. And then by the time we get 20 or 30, maybe we've been through 5 or 6 major world plans for how we were going to become very happy. But it's not just you, it's not just you didn't get the right breaks, it's not that you didn't do it quite the way it could have been done, but it never works. It just cracked up that way, Material life is designed to look like you can get material happiness, but somehow or other it never really pans out. But if you're serious and you think that it's there, then you probably want to go on to the next room over or to the next YouTube channel or whatever it is, because Bhagavad Gita won't do much for you. Nor do you need to believe 100%, but many people have come to the conclusion that this material world, there's something fishy about it, and there must be some bottom line somehow or other. So even if you provisionally accept Bhagavad Gita and you try to act on some of the principles of Bhagavad Gita, controlling your senses, chanting Hare Krishna, eating prasadam, avoiding certain regulative principles. We don't eat meat, we don't gamble, have illicit sex, take intoxicants. If you do those things, your consciousness will change, your life will change, your karma will change, and it will be palpable. People who are uncommitted to, even if they hear or read something, they're not going to put anything into practice, they will probably forget most of Bhagavad Gita and it won't change them. However, this Gita and the movement that goes with it has made a big difference and impact on thousands and thousands of people. So when we come to Bhagavad Gita, we come to Bhagavad Gita with a attitude, and depending on what that attitude is, we either get something from it or we don't. Now, we're not saying that you have to join or move into the temple, but you do have to hear and understand Bhagavad Gita in association, as we said in the early part here, that Arjuna took instruction from Krishna. He became Krishna's disciple. So he understood from Krishna who was speaking it. And so, again, if you have any interest in pursuing Bhagavad Gita, if you get into Bhagavad Gita, you'll realize that it propounds a philosophy that is very comprehensive, very self-consistent, and plausible, and it endures over time. It will make a difference in your life. It's made a difference in my life. It can make a difference in anybody's life, but you have to understand it properly, and you have to actually try, even if it's not completely perfectly, try to put the ideas contained in Bhagavad Gita into practical effect in your life. Okay, so questions as we wrap up here. So this is our section, I think we did 10 and 11 today, so this is 11. And
I come up with a question.
Yeah, okay.
You said before, something like everything in the Vedas are actually applicable to our lives. It's not just like a story or something. But sometimes it's hard to understand, like how to withdraw that, how to apply to my life some things. Can you give any advice on that?
How do you apply Bhagavad Gita?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or other texts as well.
Yeah, so when a person associates with the temple, we learn that there are daily activities, and we begin to, if you live close enough, you can participate in daily activities. If you don't live close enough, then you can learn what various basic possibilities are in doing service. There are 9 kinds of devotional service: Shravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu, Smaranam, Padasevanam, Archanam, Vandanam, Dasyam, Sakyam, Atmini Videnam. So you learn how to perform these various 9 types of service, because the mind usually finds difficulty in focusing on just one approach, So therefore, the process of Krishna consciousness is so nice that you can segue from one approach to a different approach to a different approach throughout the course of the day. And eventually you can learn how to engross your entire day in some aspect of Krishna consciousness. So partly it's associating enough to learn what those practices are, how to do them, and then as time goes on, you hear the philosophy more, and you become a part of various projects that are happening in the temple. And in this way, your life and your purposes and everything become involved in bhakti yoga. Does that answer your question?
I don't know. I hear you and I understand. I don't want this to be but I don't feel it. I don't know. I still don't know.
Give the examples of what you do throughout the day.
What's that?
Give the examples of what you do throughout the day.
Well, usually the devotees in the temple here, we all get up and from about 4:30 to about 5:30, there's the first part of the morning program where we chant Hare Krishna, we chant the Mangalartik prayers. So people get up, they wash, and then they come to the temple room, and then there's the morning program where we sing, and we're looking at the deities, we're trying to meditate on the deities. And then after that, then there's Tulsi Puja. After that, then there's a japa time where we chant on beads. You have beads, or
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you chant on beads, and as you're chanting on beads, eventually you become more focused, and you begin to see some of the magic of trying to wrestle with the mind, the crazy monkey-like mind, and focusing it on this sound vibration. And eventually you become purified by that. And as we become more purified by Krishna consciousness, our material desires tend to fade, and we begin to realize that there's a lot of things we can do to help others become Krishna conscious, and we can help the projects that are already going on in the temple to outreach and so on and so forth. And in this way, we become more and more involved. So after that morning program, after chanting, we do that till about 7:30, I think it is. Then there's a second unveiling of the deities when the curtains move aside, and there's another chanting for the deities. There's we offer a special puja to Srila Prabhupada, where we do a song for Srila Prabhupada. And then we have class, Bhagavad Gita class, or Bhagavatam class generally. And then after that is prasadam, and then, there's usually some individual time up until about midday or 1 or 2 o'clock, when everybody here, a lot of the devotees go out to some location where they chant. Either they go to Barclay Center, or they go to Times Square, or what's the other place? Union Square, that's what I'm trying to say. And Washington Square, depending on where they, today I think they went to 42nd Street and in the Times Square area there or something like that. So at any rate, this is kind of the run of it. Then they come back, and there's sometimes some other prasadam after that, some food. So this is kind of a daily occurrence. So the life of a devotee is to hear about Krishna, to try to chant, to try to engage in service. And as we do that, we begin to realize that actually it's not half bad, that the process of Krishna consciousness is supplanting gradually this, pie-in-the-sky concept that we had pioneered for our whole lives, that never really worked out, So now we're doing it, but we don't take it as seriously anymore. And we are also becoming purified and satisfied in the process of doing devotional service, bhakti yoga.
The activities also depends on the location of this place. Also,
people are going to
I'm just continuing with your thing.
Yeah.
The activities also depends on the location, I'm saying.
Yeah.
Because
right.
it is here in New York, it's a different kind of environment. If it is like Vrindavan or New Vrindavan, or in India, a lot of places, there will be Go Seva also.
Right.
And there is cooking of the
there's
food,
lots of stuff.
and
some people engage in cooking.
People go
or
personally
cleaning.
to devotees and give some instructions, or they kind of also. So depends on the location also.
Yeah.
There will be more activities. That's what.
Right. Okay. So, at any rate, we can go take some prasadam, and we'll shut this down. And if there are more questions, we can do those. Are they serving here, or they're serving over at the other? We'll have to see. All right. So, at any rate, thank you all very much. And next week we will be doing Western philosophy, and then world religions after that, and so forth. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Now I'm going to do a timing clap so that I can sync my cameras and recording devices.